Today's lecture will be about Western expansion, the movement west of individuals in the United States between 1840 and 1900. It will be divided into four parts, and the first part will look at two aspects of Western expansion, namely manifest destiny and the settlement of people, how they settled, what they did while they were there, etc. A little bit of background before we get into that. Before the mid-1800s, land west of the Mississippi River, which originally divided east from west, was largely unexplored. People basically thought that it was only suitable for the Indians, and a lot of explorers who went out into this region basically confirmed this belief. For example, a man by the name of Major Stephen Harriman Long, who led an expedition through Missouri and into Yellowstone, what is now Yellowstone, in 1819, described the Great Plains as basically an arid desert and a very useless region. And this mindset permeated mid-18th and 19th century beliefs. Now, a change began in the 1840s, and this basically was rooted in a combination of economic opportunity and also a change in ideology. We'll talk more about what this ideology was. But it's noteworthy that the federal government gave a number of incentives to get people to travel into this region. And a large reason for people traveling was what is known as the Panic of 1837. This was an economic crisis in the country which resulted largely from a decreasing economy in Europe, which affected the United States. And as a result of this, people started to question urban America and what that could bring to them. And so they decided, well, maybe there's more opportunities out west, particularly with commercial farming. However, the panic also caused a lack of financial resources. And so for many, this was impossible. It was only possible for the middle class to make this journey, people who were either wealthy or had some sort of fiscal stability. Now, it was also philosophical in nature, the reason that people moved to the West. And by that, I mean that the Indians lived out west. And people came to believe that the country and the heathens, as they called them, which occupied the West, were destined to come under the civilizing rule of European Americans and their superior technology, namely railroads and telegraphs, which were developing during this period. Now, whether this was a heartfelt concern for the people that lived in the West, the Indians that lived in the West, or it was just rationalization that the people came up with to rationalize their reasons for moving west is unclear. However, the scars, the effects of their actions continue and still have an effect today. Now, the philosophical ideology that a lot of individuals adopted during this period was basically the concept of manifest destiny. Now, the first time that we see this phrase was actually in a magazine titled the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, and the term was used by a man who was called John O'Sullivan in 1845. And I've given you a quote here from the magazine where this phrase appears. And in the magazine it says that it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our multiplying millions. And he's basically talking at this point about Texas and about the expansion into the newly acquired Texas territory. However, this ideology, this concept of manifest destiny, really created a spirit throughout the country, was adopted by numerous intellectuals, numerous individuals, and was an essential part of the decision to expand to the west. Now, Manifest Destiny basically encapsulates a very simple idea, and I've given you the idea here. The idea is that Americans were destined or divinely ordained to expand democratic institutions throughout the continent. Now, you'll notice that this is very similar to the concept that Americans have today, particularly in Iraq, Afghanistan, and situations like that where we feel compelled to go and spread democracy. And the same concept existed during this period. Now, as opposed to what many people in the eastern part of the United States thought at the time, the West, however, wasn't empty. There were Hispanic communities living in the Southwest. As I mentioned before, there were diverse Indian tribes throughout the West. And there were also other settlers from Asia and Western Europe, which we'll talk about in a minute. So this concept of Manifest Destiny, they weren't just expanding into a region where no one existed. There were lots of individuals in these areas. They were doing more than just filling empty space. Now, O'Sullivan's spark, his concept of Manifest Destiny, led to waves of Americans and recently arrived immigrants to moving to the West, mainly using wagon trains. We'll talk more about wagon trains in a minute. Now, they used a number of identifiable trails which had been used by previous explorers such as Lewis and Clark. And the trails I've given you here, namely the Oregon Trail, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, the Santa Fe Trail, and the California Trails. And all of these trails were used by immigrants in the mid-19th century to move into the West. Now, as I mentioned before, the main way that they moved was not by foot, because the Oregon Trail in particular was 2,000 miles long, so it was impossible to expand to go such a long distance by foot. But they used wagons, which I'm sure everyone has seen before. We'll look at a picture of these in a minute. But they used wagons to move out west, and wagons were a very common sight during this period. Here's an example of an illustration of a wagon train from this period right here. Now, the height of migration was between 1845 and 1870, and during this period, over 400,000 settlers followed the path from Missouri. So 400,000 people traveled in this 25-year period. Now, the federal government, as I mentioned before, was instrumental in allowing this migration to happen, and it was primarily afforded by two legislative acts which occurred in 1862. The first piece of legislation was known as the Homestead Act, and basically this was born out of President Lincoln's concern that the Union, if it was defeated, might result in an expansion of slavery. He was very concerned that slavery might spread out west. And the Homestead Act was a response to this, to encourage the concept of free soil in the West, which meant that slaves would not exist there. Now, I've given you some of the stipulations of the Homestead Act here, but it's noteworthy that the Homestead Act allowed any head of a household or an individual over 21, and this included unmarried women, to receive a parcel of 160 acres of land for a nominal filing fee. So basically they got this land for free. The only requirement that was stipulated in the Homestead Act is that they would have to improve the land within 5 years. Now, improvement didn't mean much. It mainly meant building houses in this region, so it was very simple to do this. And under this Homestead Act, the government actually transferred 270 million acres of public domain land to private citizens during this period. So a very large amount of land was transferred during this period through this act. Now the second act, which I've also given you in this slide, is the Pacific Railway Act. Now the Pacific Railway Act basically commissioned two railroads to build a track from the east to the west. The first company was Union Pacific Railroad, and it was commissioned to build a new track from Omaha, Nebraska, while Central Pacific Railroad was commissioned to move east from Sacramento, California. Now, as part of this deal, both companies would have ownership of all public lands which existed 200 feet from the track on each side, plus other grants and payments which made this worthwhile. So it was very lucrative for these railroads to have this, and they made a big profit from this. Now, it was ultimately completed when these two companies connected their tracks at a place called Promontory Point in Utah in the spring of 1869. And I've given you a picture of Promontory Point here. You can see here's the employees of the two companies. There are two trains, and they've completed the track at what was known as the ceremony of the golden spike. So they put a spike which was colored gold right in the middle of these two tracks, and this was an extremely significant engineering feat during this period, constructing a railway that moved all the way from Omaha, Nebraska to California and basically connected Omaha, which was connected with the east, to the west. Now, the government also did other things during this period, including building forts. And forts were mainly built to protect and assist settlers during their migration. There were two significant forts during this period. One was Fort Laramie in Wyoming. It was built in 1834. And the other was Fort Apache in Arizona in 1870. Now, Fort Apache was mainly built to protect settlers from the Indians and also maintain peace from warring tribes because there was a lot of concern about that, and we'll talk more about the Indians and the concerns that derived from them later. Now, the forts also became important trading posts for miners and trappers, and they also gave relief in times of drought. There was significant drought during this period, particularly in the Midwest, because in the Great Plains there's very little water, and this was a big problem for a number of people, and they were very concerned about this. Now this brings us to the second part of the lecture, namely part 2, Life on the Range. And in this part of the lecture we'll talk about who the settlers were, what they did, how they lived, etc. Now, who were the settlers? As I mentioned before the Homestead Act, etc., these were essentially wealthy and prosperous white individuals. There were very few other people that were able to make this journey during this period. Now, poor individuals were able to come after the Homestead Act. And as I mentioned before, nearly 400,000 people made the trek from east to west by the height of the movement in 1870. Now, many of these individuals were men, but some families came too, and a number of immigrants came as well, particularly immigrants from Northern Europe and Canada, particularly Germans, Scandinavians, and Irish. These were the most common immigrants that made the journey west. And there were more opportunities for these recent immigrants out west than there were for other individuals, than there were in the east. Now, the Germans, Scandinavians, and Irish, they settled and created communities that were very similar to what they left behind. 18,000 Scandinavians traveled or existed in the United States in 1850, and by 1900, after the move out west, 1.1 million Scandinavians existed in the West. So you can see there's a big jump in number in the 50 years once Western expansion happened. Now, many of the Scandinavians in particular moved to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, and a lot of the people in these regions today still have this ancestry. Now, the Chinese, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, were also existed in the West. They were less numerous, but more than 200,000 arrived in California in the late 19th century because of the gold rush. So a big reason for the Chinese coming to California during this period was gold. Now, whites and Chinese and European immigrants were not the only individuals that moved out west. There were also thousands of African Americans that migrated to the West after the Civil War, and these individuals were known as exodusters. Exo comes from exodus, and this mainly refers to the biblical flight from Egypt, which the Jews made under the leadership of Moses in the Old Testament. And the African American settlers basically adopted this name because they felt, just like the Jews were escaping from the tyranny of the Egyptians, that they were fleeing the racism of the South. And a majority of these individuals went to Kansas. In fact, about 25,000 arrived in Kansas in the year 1879. So a large number arrived in Kansas during this period. Now, by 1890, 500,000 black people lived west of the Mississippi, and a majority became farmers. But as we'll talk about in a minute, about 12,000 also worked as cowboys during the Texas cattle drives. They were very significant. And they were called buffalo soldiers. A number of other ones were called buffalo soldiers because they fought with the United States in the war against the Indians. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the buffalo soldiers before, and allegedly the reason that the African American soldiers were called buffalo soldiers is that the Indians named them this, and it was because their black curly hair reminded them of the buffalo. Now, it's impossible to substantiate this particular thought. However, it makes sense in a number of factors, and a number of academics agree with this interpretation. Now, many of the buffalo soldiers were ex-Union soldiers. If any of you have ever seen the movie Glory, you'll note that African Americans did serve in the Union Army. And so these ex-Union soldiers were used to protect settlers from Indian attacks, and they also helped develop infrastructure in the towns that were settled, in the mining towns, etc. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, here's a photograph of some buffalo soldiers from the period, and you'll notice they're wearing military garb. Now, many Hispanics were also in the West, as we discussed before. And many Hispanics were also already in the Southwest prior to the U.S. government seizing land during its war with Mexico. Now, as I'm sure for those of you that took U.S. History 1, there was a war with Mexico between 1846 and 1848. This war was ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which the United States granted U.S. citizenship to anyone who chose to stay in the land after it switched ownership. This was one of the three alternatives that people that lived, or Hispanics that lived in the West had during this period. And that's the first point that I've given you: live in the U.S. but have Mexican citizenship. They could also become U.S. citizens, or they could leave for Mexico. A majority of the people chose the second option, become U.S. citizens. However, despite such guarantees. Within one generation, Hispanic American citizens found their culture under attack, and legal protection was not so great, and we'll talk more about the Hispanics later on in this lecture. Now let's move on to the life of the pioneer farmers during this period. As I mentioned before, a majority of the people were farmers. Some were soldiers, but a majority of them were farmers, particularly during the early period. And as we talked about before, they were afforded the possibility of coming there through the Homestead Act, and they were known as sod busters. The reason they were known as sod busters was because they had a very difficult life, and they lived in houses which were made of sod. And we'll talk more about these houses in a minute. But the sod busters basically settled in the Midwest states known as Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, North Dakota and South Dakota. And irrigation was really necessary in the Southwest because of a lack of rain. We talked about drought before, and it was very necessary to have water and therefore irrigation. But it was difficult to find water, and building systems of irrigation was also difficult for many people because they didn't have the materials to do so, particularly wood and other things. Now, it was not until 1902, which is almost 50 years after the beginning of the Homestead Act, that what is known as the New Lands Reclamation Act was passed to set aside funds for the sale of public lands to build dams for irrigation, which would help irrigation and things like that. But unfortunately, it was not possible to do this earlier on. Now, as I mentioned before, the reason these people were known as sod busters was because they lived in sod houses, and they made the houses basically with mud and sod, and they had thatch roofs because there was little timber. But when it did rain, when drought was not existent, obviously, if your house is made of mud and sod, it causes big problems. The mud would fall in, animals would live in the sod, etc. And I've given you a picture of a sod house here. As you can see, it was very meager, and this was the reason that these individuals were known as sod busters. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Little House on the Prairie, which depicts this lifestyle, and is noteworthy that during this period, these concepts of a meager life, which was also idealistic in a number of ways, was very popular. And Laura Ingalls Wilder was a top-selling author during this period. And in many ways, she has solidified our own thoughts about what life was during this homesteading era. Now, apart from the other challenges that we've discussed, such as drought, they also faced other issues such as poor land, and it's not surprising when you look at the types of areas that they were attempting to settle in. As you can see from this map, which illustrates the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the California Trail, they had to settle and go through places like Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and these are not prime locations for good agricultural land. Now, apart from the quality of the land, another challenge that the homesteaders faced was very few materials such as wood for building, etc., which was a big problem. That's one of the reasons they lived in sod houses. They also faced very harsh weather that they didn't have to confront in the east, such as tornadoes, blizzards, the droughts that we referred to before. And they also faced insect problems, particularly with the locusts, which I'm sure all of you are aware of or are familiar with. Locusts are basically large grasshoppers. They're notorious for being in the plague described in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, which we discussed before. And there are numerous accounts of the locusts basically destroying everything that the homesteaders were growing. In fact, in some accounts, they're described as being on the ground about 6 to 12 inches deep. You can imagine how many locusts that is, and them basically eating everything that is planted by man, all fruit trees, all vegetation, etc. So this was a big problem for the homesteaders. The biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems that they faced, was also debt and foreclosure by the banks. Now, under the Homestead Act, they got the land virtually for free, but in order to have their farms, they needed lots of different products, livestock, etc. They needed horses, wagons, wells, fencing, seeds, fertilizer, and you needed money to buy these things. Now, the railroads, which we talked about before, charged very high prices for equipment and livestock, and the banks also charged very high interest rates. So basically what a lot of the homesteaders did is they got caught in a never-ending cycle of borrowing money from the bank with the intention of repaying the debt after the harvest. Now, this created large problems for a lot of the homesteaders, and ultimately a lot of their farms fell into foreclosure as a result of this. Now, not all farms had such problems. There were farms known as the Bonanza farms. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the 1960s TV show Bonanza, which was very popular in the US. And this name of this show is basically derived from a type of farm which existed, which was more than simply a family farm. And these farms became very wealthy, very rich, and were able to avoid many of the problems that the homesteading farms had. Now, all of the Bonanza farms had in excess of 20,000 acres, and many of them hired migrant farmers. Many of the homesteaders actually came to the West with the intention of having their own farms, but once they realized how difficult life was, they got on board with these Bonanza farms, and they worked for the Bonanza farms as employees of the Bonanza farms. And ultimately, the family farms suffered as a result of this, and this led to a lot of frustration and revolts, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Now, life was even more difficult for women than for men in the West. The West was male-dominated, but the Homestead Act actually did encourage women, families, and a domestic lifestyle in the West. The government wanted this because they knew that the success of the West was ultimately tied to family life. And the women ultimately faced many of the problems that the men did with insects, drought, etc. But they also had the additional complication of childbirth and pregnancy issues. There were no doctors, no midwives in the West, and many women died from treatable complications, as did their newborns, because of a lack of access to medical care. So this was a big problem. Now, apart from the farmers' wives, some of the women did find employment, but most of them were housekeepers. Now, the employment that the women found were as teachers, cooks, seamstresses, but really, originally, most of the women didn't enjoy many rights. They couldn't sell property, they couldn't sue for divorce, they couldn't serve on juries. Initially, they couldn't vote either in local elections, federal elections, etc. As I mentioned, most of them were housekeepers, and they worked on the farms. They worked 9 hours a day doing chores, cleaning, and a lot of women actually compared life on the frontier to being a slave. They thought it was a terrible situation to be in, and a lot of these women ended up being in the insane asylums as well. However, living on the farm, living in the West, did empower women in various social and legal ways as the decades progressed. First of all, they lived more equally with their husbands, then wives and husbands lived in the East. They took over responsibility for the farm when their husband died, and this was often rare in the East when it would fall to a male relative or a son, etc. And they also made a lot of important decisions for the home and were treated as equals or more equal by their husbands than were the women in the East. So in a lot of ways, these pioneer wives were actually the forerunners of the modern feminist movements and were able to contribute a lot to this. And it's substantiated in the fact that the first states to gain women's rights, including the rights to vote, were actually states in the Pacific Northwest and the Upper Midwest. And this is not surprising considering the fact that women's rights were, or women were more equal in the West than they were in the East, particularly as the decades progressed. Now this ultimately brings us to the third part of the lecture. We've talked about farming a lot, and this brings us to two other ways that people earned a living in the West, namely by mining and cattle grazing. Now, the allure of gold is a common theme in history, and in the American West, it's no different. And the desire for gold was a lot more enticing than the desire to be a homesteader for many people. And the discovery of gold, which as you will see on this slide was at Sutner's Mill in Colma, California, was basically the beginning of a transformation for the West and a new era in Western settlement. And for decades, this would be known as the California Gold Rush, in which people rushed to the West to try and gain a fortune, not by farming, but by discovering gold. And the rushes of prospectors who would descend on the newly discovered sites were known as 49ers. And 49ers, who the American football team is named after, were basically individuals who sifted gold out of the dirt or out of gravel through panning, etc., or through what's known as a sluice box, which would move the gold from the dirt, etc., in streams. And this was the main way that people mined gold during this early period. Now, this was repeated in other states like Colorado and Nevada for several decades. But in 1859, a man by the name of Henry T.P. Comstock, who was actually a Canadian-born fur trapper, was mining gold in Nevada with numerous others when he discovered a blue-colored vein in the rock, which happened to be the first substantial discovery of silver in the U.S. in 1859. And so now you have not only gold, which brings people to the West, but silver as well. And copper also became a major mining product during this period, particularly in the states of Arizona and Montana, which was very valuable during this period because of the growth of electrical lines, the need for electrical lines, and the growth of the telegraph industry, which relied on copper wiring to sell telegraphs. So we have these three products, gold, silver, and copper, which basically transformed the West in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. Now, in the 1860s and 70s, as I just discussed, mining was popular, but it was also less successful on an individual basis. And this was largely because people like the 49ers and other individuals had sifted all of the gold out of the rivers and had found all of the low-lying fruit, as it was known, and it was impossible for them to get gold, silver, or copper, which was located in more remote areas deep in the earth. machines and large amounts of capital and money were needed to obtain this gold through mine shafts, etc. And basically there's a shift towards larger business ventures during this period, which would underwrite the mining operations and also create cities in the process. Particularly the city of Denver, Colorado was a permanent settlement which arose during this time, largely because of the ventures of large corporations which needed cities to support mining operations in the region. Now, I've given you a couple of illustrations of mining in the West. You'll see in part A, or in picture A, there's an example of some 49ers from the period, which are sifting gold out of the river. This was the original way to mine gold in the region. And then in B, you have a more industrial mining operation, which was carried out by the corporations. Now, the life of the miners was worse in many ways than the life of the homesteaders. In fact, 8,000 people died during this period from the very dangerous work that they had to undertake. The miners who didn't strike it rich worked for daily pay, very low wages. They had to work underground in high temperatures. They got lung disease from the various dusts that they inhaled. There were shaft fires, dynamite explosions, cave-ins, etc. And many people, apart from dying, also had crippling injuries which maimed them for life. As a result of these difficult conditions, some people tried to organize unions and led strikes for better conditions, but ultimately these unions were crushed by state militias, and the difficult conditions for miners continued. Now, the legacy of mining still exists today, and there's still examples of a lot of what existed in the Southwest. If you go there today, first of all, there are ghost towns. A ghost town is basically the remnants of a town which once existed, and many of the mining towns, as the ore dried up, turned into ghost towns. There's also law and order, which I've given you here on the chart. And this is the main lasting impact of the mining efforts, because the U.S. government really wanted to bring law and order to the Wild West, as it was known, to efficiently extract resources and encourage stable growth. So during the homesteading period, there was very little law and order, but once the mining activities start, the U.S. decides, well, we need some law and order. We need something to keep society stable. So they send police and government functions, government organizations, government bureaucracy to the West to make it more stable. And this is a lasting impact of mining in the region, and it existed in a way that didn't exist during the homesteading period. Lastly, new states were a legacy of the mining period. States like Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming are largely the result of these early mining enterprises, and all of these states cropped up in the second half of the 19th century. Now, apart from mining, the importance of cattle should not be underestimated. For centuries prior to the movement of white settlers to the west, wild cattle roamed the Spanish borderlands in this region, like California, etc. And at the end of the Civil War, it's been estimated that 5 million longhorn steers could be found in Texas. So that's an extremely large number of cattle. Now, few settlers had capitalized them previous to the mid-19th century because transport was so difficult. However, as we talked about before, now there's a transcontinental railroad, and that changed things. Cattle ranchers and eastern businessmen began to profit by rounding up all of these wild steers, this 5 million in Texas, etc., and transporting them by rail for as much as $30 to $50 per head, which was a lot of money in the mid-19th century. Cattle drives also began in the 1860s and 70s, and the famous Chisholm Trail, which was a quick path from Texas to the railroad terminals in Abilene, Wichita, and Dodge City, Kansas, were formed, and here cowboys would get highly paid. We'll talk more about cowboys in a second and what they were. But these towns, like Abilene, Wichita, and Dodge City, became known as cow towns. And a man by the name of Joseph G. McCoy, who was born in Illinois, was actually a pioneer of these cattle drives. And he chose Abilene and other cities because they would offer a place for the cowboys to bring their cattle. And these towns developed into major urban centers because of this. Now, the cowboys were individuals who roamed the Great Plains and rounded up cattle. And between 1865 and 1885, as you'll see on this slide, there were over 40,000 cowboys on the Great Plains, which was a large number, and much more than the movies that Hollywood puts out give us the impression of. Now, typically cowboys were in their 20s, between 21 and 29, and over a third were Hispanic or African American. So not all of these were white individuals from the East. They were also Hispanic or African American. And the stereotype of the American cowboy was borrowed from the Mexicans who had settled those lands before the white Americans came there. Now, as you can see in this picture, here's a stereotypical cowboy, a picture which was taken from the period. And the objects which the cowboys borrowed from the Mexicans were things like saddles, lassos, chaps, and these aspects define the cowboy, and they originated with the Mexicans who used them long before the white cowboys came to this region. So the Mexicans were instrumental in this cultural aspect. Now, the life of a cowboy was very dirty and unglamorous. They lived in difficult terrain, had conflict with Native Americans in some instances, especially in the Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma. However, it was well paid, and that enticed a lot of people to go there. However, eventually this era of the free range, in which these capitalists took advantage of the steers roaming in the wild in Texas and other regions, ended because ranchers developed the land, limited grazing opportunities along the trails, etc. And in 1873, there was also a new invention, namely barbed wire, which allowed ranchers to fence off land and ultimately the cattle as well. And this transformed the West, and ultimately transformed the West into a region that was dominated by Eastern businesses, much like the mining enterprises that we discussed before. And a lot of capital investors from the East ended the cattle drives as we knew them. Here's a picture of a patent for the barbed wire which was issued during this period. And that brings us ultimately to the issue of violence in the West, and whether or not this was a myth or a reality. Now, rough men in a rough life did exist in the West, but the violence is greatly exaggerated and even glorified because of the dime store novels of the day, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with through Western movies. The exploits of men like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and others, they made for good stories, but the violence was far more isolated than is portrayed in these stories and in the Hollywood films. Often violence resulted from struggles for scarce resources like wood, water, etc., or for the sudden wealth or poverty of prospectors, whether that be for gold or for cattle, etc. Now, most of the violence was concentrated in mining towns or in range wars, which we'll talk more about in a minute, by large or small cattle ranchers. Now, some of the mining towns did fit the stereotype of the violent West. They had things like fighting, drinking, frontier justice, like hanging, etc. And the mining town of Brody, California is a good example. It had 29 murders between 1877 and 1883, which is a higher rate than any city at the time. However, only one man was ever convicted for any of these murders. So a lot of the violence was outside of the bounds of law and order. Now, the most prolific gunman of the day was a man by the name of John Wesley Hardin, who allegedly killed over 20 men in Texas, including one man who snored too loudly in a hotel. All right, so men like this did exist, but they were very rare. Here's an example of the types of things that you could see in some of these cities. It's a pub or saloon with people drinking and the sort of rough types that you would see in these particular cities. But as I mentioned before, such types of situations were rare. Now, violence also existed in ranching, which I talked a little bit about before. And this is largely because of barbed wire. As I mentioned before, large ranchers barbed wired off grazing lands and watering holes in particular, places where they took cows and horses to water themselves or to get water. And this made a lot of cowboys and other individuals very frustrated, and they basically turned to violence and vandalism. They cut barbed wire, and they also rushed cattle. And what I mean by that is once they cut the barbed wire, they led the steers into their own herds as they left. Right. Now, an infamous example of this is what is known as the Fence Cutting War, which occurred in Clay County, Texas, between 1883 and 1884. During this event, the cowboys destroyed the fences that ranchers set up on public lands, which they did not have a right to enclose, which the ranchers did not have a right to enclose. And the conflict resulted in 3 deaths, not a war as it was called, but 3 deaths. But this ultimately got the governor's attention, and the Texas legislature passed laws to outlaw fence cutting, but also laws to remove the fences on public lands and to place gates on the passage between public and private lands so that they could have access to watering holes, etc. So even though the fence cutting war was not a war, it did result in legislation. Another example of violence was in Johnson County, Wyoming, when ranchers organized what was known as a lynching bee between 1891 and 1892 to make examples of cattle rustlers. They hired 22 invaders, what were called invaders from Texas, to work as hired guns, and the ranch owners hunted and killed 2 rustlers during this event. So it's only 2 rustlers, it was violence, but it's nowhere near what is depicted in popular fiction. Now ultimately, as I mentioned before, the federal government intervened in this as well, and were highly aware of such events and worked to lower them. Now, women were also in cattle towns as well, but they were very rare. Most cowboys were single men. In the town of Comstock Lode, which was part of Nevada, there were 30 women and 2,500 men, so it shows the disparity there. And a majority of the women who lived in the West were prostitutes. So they did not have the sort of employment opportunities in these cattle towns that the men did. Eventually, some of the women came to own their own brothels, became businesswomen in their own right, and also about 600 women are recorded during this period in the cattle towns that were teachers. So it was possible for the women to gain employment in the cattle towns. Now, the West was ultimately transformed as families went west, and the lawlessness actually went with that. It changed. The lawlessness changed because of the influx of families. In Abilene, Kansas, for example, it transformed when middle-class women arrived in the 1880s with their cattle-bearing husbands, rich cattlemen. And the women did things like organized churches, schools, civic clubs. They tried to promote family values. And they also fought prostitution and other vices like drinking and things like that during this period. So the influx of women actually pacified the Wild West. Protestant ministers were also very influential during this period, both ministers and missionaries, who joined the women, and they were somewhat successful in what they did. And even when they were not successful, they did bring attention to the problems, which was very significant. And as a response to the attention that was brought by the Protestant ministers and missionaries and the women as well, congressional legislation was passed in the late 19th century, the first of which was known as the Comstock Law. And the Comstock Law basically banned the spread of lewd literature through the mail. So one of the things that was sent through the mail evidently during this period was lewd literature, and this ended this. And there was also what was known as the Page Act of 1875, and this prohibited the transport of women into the United States for employment as prostitutes. So because of the women and the Protestant ministers, this issue of prostitution and lewdness was put to an end legally. However, brothels continued to operate in some instances. Okay, this ultimately brings us to the last part of the lecture, namely the Indians, Chinese, and Hispanics. As people moved west, they inevitably came into conflict with Indian tribes. Ultimately, the threat of attack by the Indians was slim, and it was definitely not proportional to the actions that the U.S. Army later took against them. There were some occasional attacks and some retribution attacks, and some clashes were brutal by the Indians. But most of the brutality was actually at the hands of the settlers. The settlers often came with the help of militias and later the U.S. government and sought to remove Indians from the land. The Indians obviously did not have the same weapons as the white settlers did, and they often lacked the cohesion that the U.S. government had because of the fact that they were distinct tribes. Ultimately, these actions led to the end of the Indian way of life, and this is what we're going to talk about for the next few slides. Now, during the mid and the late part of the 19th century, as many as 250,000 Indians populated the Great Plains. Many of these individuals were forced there by previous actions by the U.S. government, such as the Trail of Tears, which was carried out by President Andrew Jackson. And during the Western government, during the Western settlement, the U.S. government was also prepared to take similar actions to get the land that the Indians were living on. They adopted two strategies to move them out. The first strategy was peaceful, and the second strategy was more militaristic. The first strategy essentially involved negotiated settlements. A good example of this is the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. And during this treaty, the tribes in the Great Plains and the chiefs who ruled over them agreed to establish distinct tribal borders, which essentially codified the reservation system. So in other words, each tribe had to be located in a specific region and could not move out of this region, very similar to the reservations that exist today. Now, in return for agreeing to these borders that the tribes had to remain in, each tribe would receive annual payments of $50,000 as well as a promise of non-interference from the settlers. Now, ultimately, due to corruption, many of the payments never reached the tribes, particularly after about 10 years. There was encroachment upon the settlements, and some of the reservations ended up being destitute, and the people ended up starving as a result of the lack of money and supplies that were promised to them. As more moved in, even the reservations were targets for farming and mining, and this led to the second strategy which was adopted by the U.S. government, namely attacks or forceful removals. Rather than new treaties, settlers simply attacked the tribes, and they did this usually out of fear or to force them off of the land. Now, some Indians resisted these attacks and faced massacres or carried out massacres themselves. In 1862, one of the best examples of this is the Dakota War. Now, the Sioux Indians who were living in Minnesota became frustrated by the fact that they weren't receiving their $50,000 a year. They were also upset by the fact that settlers were encroaching upon their land, and they rebelled in what is known as the Dakota War by killing the white settlers on their lands. Now, during this time, over 1,000 settlers were captured or killed in the attack before a local militia run by the U.S. government retained control. And during this point, when they retained control, 400 Sioux were captured and 303 were sentenced to death. However, President Lincoln intervened during this period and released all but 38 of these Indians. The 38 Indians which were retained were hung, and this has and is the largest mass execution in U.S. history. So if you're ever asked what the largest execution in U.S. history was, it was after the Dakota War. Now, ultimately, after this, the Sioux in Minnesota was banished. Other examples of Indian reactions happened in Colorado, where the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes fought, and militias were formed and decimated the tribes which fought. Another example was in Colorado as well, in a place called Sand Creek, where Colonel John Chivington led a militia raid on a group which had already reached a peaceful settlement. They had already come to peace with the settlers in the region. In fact, the camp was flying an American flag and even a white flag of surrender when John Chivington arrived. Now, Chivington's troops murdered close to 100 people. A majority of these people were women and children, so it was a terrible massacre. And it is actually known by the name of the region where it happened. It was known as the Sand Creek Massacre. And for the rest of his life, Shivington actually displayed the scalps of the 100 people that he killed in his collection. And he was very proud of this. So this shows the brutality that some of the U.S. forces carried out on the Indian tribes. Later on, ultimately, the U.S. Army condemned Shivington's actions, but they also Shivington's actions served as a model for later settlers, and they would do similar things to the Indians that they encountered. Now, to prevent all-out war, which the U.S. Congress was really worried about, they commissioned a committee in the late 19th century to investigate the causes of the incidents which were just described, such as the Dakota War and the Sand Creek Massacre. 2 treaties were later passed. The first treaty was the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, and the other treaty was the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek. Now, the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie was designed to move the Indians to more remote reservations to keep them out of the way of settlers. And they moved the Sioux to the Black Hills in the Dakota Territory. And the second, known as the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, moved the Cheyenne, the Arapahoe, and several other tribes, including the Comanche, to what was known as Indian Territory or Oklahoma. However, these agreements were also short-lived because gold, shortly after the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, was discovered in the Black Hills, where they had moved the Sioux to, and settlers moved there with the backing of the U.S. cavalry. And in fact, by mid-1875, thousands of prospectors were illegally digging and panning the area for gold. Now, the Sioux, as you can imagine, protested the invasion and the violation of what had become to them in the Black Hills sacred ground. So these settlers were actually tramping on sacred ground. And the government, in response, offered to lease the Black Hills or pay the Sioux $6 million to buy it, which was a large amount of money. However, ultimately, the tribes refused, and the government imposed a fair price for the land and ordered the Indians to move in the spring of 1876. Now, the government prepared to force them out of the land, and this ultimately culminated in what is known, and what I'm sure you are familiar with in some respects, the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is the most famous battle of the American West, in which the Sioux chieftain named Sitting Bull urged Indians from other tribes to join his men and defend the land that they were taking over. Now, at the Little Bighorn River, the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry, which was led by Colonel George Custer, sought a showdown with Sitting Bull and his men. Colonel George Custer was a man of high personal ambition, and on June 25, 1876, Custer attacked what he thought was a rather minor Indian encampment. But instead, the Indians had disguised their numbers, and it was the main Sioux force. Over 3,000 Sioux warriors were there, and they surrounded and killed Colonel Custer and 262 of his men and support units. Eyewitnesses of the battle say that the Sioux bathed and wrapped Custer's body in the traditional chieftain burial ceremony. However, they dismembered the corpses of the other soldiers so that onlookers could report back about the ferocity of the Sioux. Now here's a picture of Sitting Bull, which gives you a good illustration of what people from the Sioux tribe looked like back then. Now, after Little Bighorn, there was really no further armed encounter, or a lot less further armed conflict than what existed before. Basically, a number of Indians either returned to tribal life or fled out of fear of remaining troops until the U.S. Army arrived in much larger numbers than existed with the Battle of Little Bighorn and began to exterminate the encampments or force others out. Sitting Bull ultimately fled to Canada, but later returned in 1881 and worked in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. In Montana, the Blackfoot and the Crow were forced to leave their lands. Indians were forced to leave other regions as well. And the final battle of the Indian Wars occurred in 1890 at the Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of as well. Basically, what instigated this battle was that on the reservation, the Sioux had begun to perform what is known as the ghost dance, which was a dance which told of an Indian messiah who would later deliver the tribe from hardship. They were looking for a messiah, and this dance was symbolism of that. And they did this quite frequently, and it began to scare the white settlers who lived there. Now the militia entered and prepared to round up the Sioux who were there. And the tribe, after the death of Sitting Bull, who had been arrested, shot, and killed in 1890, after his time with the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, prepared to surrender at Wounded Knee, South Dakota on December 29, 1890. Ultimately, while they were preparing to surrender, one of the young male Indians accidentally discharged his rifle while laying down his weapon, and this led the U.S. soldiers to fire upon the Indians, massacring between 150 and 300 men. The exact estimate is unclear. Women and children were also included in this count. And the U.S. government also, or the U.S. troops also suffered 25 fatalities during this period. However, a majority of them were from crossfire. After this, the U.S. government sought other alternatives to deal with the Indians. And the alternative that they chose was the Americanization of the Indians. Now, throughout the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 1880s, opinions of how the U.S. government was dealing with individuals and opinions of how the settlers were dealing with the Indians was very mixed. Some felt that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. However, several American reformers, who would ultimately end up being the background of the progressive era, which we'll talk about more in a later lecture, criticized the violence, and they argued that the Indians should be helped through what is known as Americanization to assimilate into U.S. society. Basically, the reformers argued that Indians should be assimilated through individual land ownership, Christian worship, and education for the children of Indians. And in the 1880s, this began through clergymen, government officials, and social workers. There were several means that the reformers wanted to use to Americanize the Indians. The first of these means was by removing Indian children and putting them in boarding schools. A couple of examples of boarding schools are the Carlisle Indian School and the Hampton Institute. And in these schools, the children will basically be taught to abandon their tribal traditions and embrace American ideas such as productivity, modesty, and sanctity. The schools also provided vocational training for men and also domestic science classes for women. Domestic science meaning how to take care of a household, etc. Now here's an example of a picture from one of the Indian schools in the 1880s. You can see the number of children that were there, a very large number of Indian children. Apart from Indian boarding schools, another method that the reformers used to attempt to assimilate or Americanize the Indians was religious reform, and a number of adults were targeted by religious reformers to abandon their way of life. And the ministers and priests who carried this out were both evangelical Protestants and Catholics to some extent. Another way that they attempted to Americanize the Indians was by land reform. It was also a vital part of assimilation. In earlier negotiations, the government had respected the Indian communal land philosophy. They respected the fact that no land was owned by one person and that their belief structures did not allow for individual land ownership. However, reformers wanted to replace this with real estate ownership and self-reliance, which were both European concepts. And in 1887, the Dawes Severalty Act permitted the federal government to divide the lands of any tribe and grant 160 acres of farmland, or 320 acres of grazing land, to each head of an Indian family. So basically, they forced them into private land ownership. They also permitted the Indians to hold the title of the land for 25 years, and after this time, they would get the title and citizenship rights. Now, under Dawes, the Indians were given the most arid, useless land in the U.S., so it wasn't as if the government was doing them any favors. And much of the land was actually called surplus land by the U.S. government and was claimed by the settlers. So even though the Dawes Severalty Act said that land would be divided and given to the Indians, the settlers ended up taking it anyway. Now, the final element of Americanization was what is known as the last arrow pageant. Basically, within this, the Indians were forced to assemble in their tribal clothing, carrying a bow and arrow, and they would symbolically fire their last arrow into the air and enter a tent where they stripped off the clothing, dressed in white farmers' coveralls, and emerged to take the plow and American flag to show that they had converted. So after the boarding schools, after the religious reform, after the forced real estate ownership, the last thing that they had to do was this last arrow pageant to show that they were truly American. Now, this brings us to the Chinese immigrants in the American West. We talked about the Indians, now we talk about the Chinese. And by 1880, over 300,000 Chinese lived in the United States, most of which lived in California. Now, they had dreams of gold, but many built the transcontinental railroads. They came to the U.S. for gold, but ultimately ended up building the railroad. Some also helped to farm the cotton plantations of the Old South after the war, which were left empty after the exodus of the slaves. And they booked their passage to the U.S., typically using what is known as a credit ticket. In other words, passage was paid in advance by American businessmen to whom they would be indebted for a period of work. This is very similar to indebted servitude, which was common during the early period of American colonization. Now, most of the Chinese were men. A few wives or children traveled to the U.S., but it was very, very rare for them to do so. In fact, in 1890, less than 5% of the Chinese in the West were female. And most of these individuals wanted to stay permanently in the U.S. However, they also faced a lot of problems when they arrived. The Chinese had been prohibited since 1790 from obtaining U.S. citizenship through naturalization. And they also faced harsh discrimination and violence from white settlers. Moreover, there was a special tax for Chinese minors. They were often relocated into Chinese districts. However, ultimately, Chinese immigration was stopped, and this will be important for this week's primary source discussion on the internet. Chinese immigration was stopped with what is known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1881, which forbade immigration from China for a period of 10 years. So from 1882 to 1892, no Chinese could enter U.S. borders. And you'll discuss this more in this week's primary source discussion. Here's an illustration of the Chinese working on the railroads. You'll see that they have their traditional Chinese hats on. Now, much like the Indians, there was conflict with the Chinese. Only the Indians, in fact, suffered greater discrimination and racial violence, which was legally sanctioned by the federal government. And in the 1870s, one of the forms of conflict with the white people who had immigrated or had migrated to the West was the formation of anti-coolie clubs. Now, coolie was a racial slang or a derogatory word directed toward anyone of Asian descent in the late 19th century. And anti-coolie clubs were organized during this period to boycott Chinese products, and they also lobbied for anti-Chinese laws. Now, in 1879, the California state constitution denied naturalized Chinese citizens the right to vote or hold state employment. In 1882, the U.S. government, as we discussed before, passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was also extended on multiple occasions until its repeal in 1943. And in 1885, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, tensions between white and Chinese miners erupted in a riot. And in fact, during this riot, over 24 Chinese immigrants were murdered and many more were injured. Now, because of the discrimination, some immigrants returned to China, and those that remained were often stuck in the worst jobs, though through some benevolent associations designed to support the Chinese communities, which were run by churches and other social organizations, they did find assistance, and they also found defense from political and legal discrimination. Now, Hispanics in the West are the last group that we're going to talk about. As we discussed before, in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised citizenship to 75,000 Hispanics who lived in the West. And 90% of these individuals actually accepted the offer, to live and to become U.S. citizens, despite the fact that they were ultimately relegated to second-class citizenship. Before the war, New Mexico was a hotspot for settlement by Mexicans after the Spanish independence movement in 1821, and there were 50,000 Mexicans who lived there. They were very proud of their heritage and their ability to develop ranches of great size and success. However, despite the treaty, the Californios, as the Hispanics were called, even though they didn't live in California, lost their land to white settlers, and oftentimes this was by force, if necessary. And if they wanted their land back, any sort of legal redress often fell on deaf ears, and it was also very expensive to go to court. So many times they had to settle with what was done to them. Much like the Chinese, the condition of the Hispanics was not so good. They were often relegated to the worst paying jobs under very terrible working conditions. They worked as peons, which were manual laborers, very similar to slaves. They worked as vaqueros, who were cattle herders, as cartmen, who transported food and supplies to cattle ranges, and they also worked in dangerous mining tasks, which the white settlers did not want to do. Some of these individuals fought back. In fact, between 1889 and 1890 in New Mexico, several hundred Hispanics formed what was known as the Las Gorras Blancas, or the White Caps, to reclaim the land and intimidate white Americans. During this, they raided white farms, they burned homes, they burned barns, they burned crops. But ultimately there was no real changes which emanated from this. Some of these Las Gorras Blancas were captured, beaten, imprisoned. They suffered very harsh reprisals against their families. But some of the white caps also adopted a political strategy. Instead of attacking, they sought election to local offices throughout New Mexico in the early 1890s. But in spite of their election, repression continued. Here's an example of a Mexican vaquero, very similar to the cowboys, which we discussed earlier, the ranchers. And you can see the similarities to the cowboys, which were discussed previously as well. Now, the last slide that we're going to look at is discrimination against the Hispanics. Some specific examples of this. And this was manifested in laws which attacked the heritage of these individuals. The first was known as the Sunday Laws, which prohibited noisy amusements such as bullfights, cockfights, or other cultural gatherings in the West. There were also Greaser Laws, which prohibited the imprisonment of, permitted the imprisonment of unemployed Mexican Americans on charges of vagrancy. So basically, if you were unemployed, you would get thrown in jail. And the laws ultimately took their toll on the Hispanic community. They were outnumbered, outvoted, and outcast in California and the Southwest by Anglo-American settlers. And in growing urban areas such as Los Angeles, barrios, which were clusters of working class homes, grew more isolated from the white American centers. And many of these barrios, or many of the areas that we have in Los Angeles today, are a result of these barrios, where working class Hispanic individuals were set aside from the white settlers, which run. Okay, that's the end of this lecture, and we'll move on to lecture 3 in the next class.